So first I want to say welcome and thank you very much for coming. This is the second to last event in our 2024 Harlow Summer Seminar Series. See lots of familiar faces who've been at some of you all of the talks throughout the season and many of you to at least one, so thank you so much for coming. And if you've just discovered us tonight, we're really thrilled to have you. So I want to make sure I give a plug to invite him. Our final talk of the season, which will happen next week on Thursday, it's exactly the same format as tonight. There will be a barbecue followed by the seminar style talk. And this one is the first 10 years of the Teton Alpine Stream Research Project. So that's going to be a really cool talk by Lesha Tronstadt and Scott Hodling. And they're going to talk about sort of mountaineering up to these beautiful glacial streams and doing water quality sampling and figuring out about the critters that live in those streams and how things are shifting at very high altitude in those aquatic systems. So that'll be something to look forward to. I want to mention thank you very much to those of you who filled out the mailing list sign-up sheet. If you want to get emails from us, we're very happy to send them. The only caveat I will offer is if you signed up on that sheet and you don't get an email from me, it's because I couldn't read your handwriting. So if you don't get an email starting probably on Friday or no, maybe next week, then you can always go to our website, which is UW-NPS.org, and sign up on our mailing list there, and then you can confidently type in your own email address, and I won't screw it up. The other thing is that we do advertise all of our events through the mailing list, but there are also always descriptions on our website. And we do, because we do all of our events through Zoom, we also record them. And so we'll be posting this fall all of the events that we've had throughout the season. So if there were talks that you missed that you wish you could see, or if you have a friend who you're like, man, you would have really loved this great talk on owls, then you can go back and be like, I will send you the link and go and watch it. So just plugging that as well. Tonight, we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Katherine Gura with us. Dr. Gura is a research associate with the Teton Raptor Center, and then also a research scientist with Colorado State University's Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere. So we are very fortunate to have her tonight to talk to us about owls. I know I was telling her earlier that last week, and I hope this person is here, somebody while I was grilling, but yeah, there you are in fact, somebody while I was grilling burgers was like, man, I have a weird question. How do I learn more about owls? And I was like, I have great news for you. Come to our talk next week. So I think for a lot of us, owls are this sort of fascinating, beautiful, silent creatures that we're really interested in, but that we may not get to see that often. Or maybe you do see them all the time and you're fascinated by them for that reason. So I'm really excited that we have that to look forward to. And then I'm also excited because Katherine's talk is focusing on winter ecology, which is a passion of mine. I think, we see a lot of really dramatic changes in the summer season, as we're all noticing. It's been a very hot, dry summer. We're having all those fires. But lots of things are shifting in winter as well, and it can be really easy to overlook that. And that research is often challenging in different ways because of winter conditions. So I'm stoked that we're plugging some winter research as well, even though we're on a very hot day. So hopefully you all will be able to get in the mindset of snow. For the folks on Zoom, just a quick reminder to stay muted. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will try to convey them to at the end of the talk with the other questions. Come on up. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Hillary. This is my first time at the A&P Ranch, so I'm really excited to be presenting today on the effects of changing snow conditions on one of my favorite raptors in the GYE, the great gray owl. So I know it might be hard to believe, as Hillary said, on this really hot afternoon at the ranch today, but actually snow covers over a third of our planet, either seasonally or long-term. And as a result, snow has huge implications and huge effects on a variety of ecological processes throughout much of our planet. And this includes having incredible effects on wildlife. So for example, snow can impact predator-prey dynamics. It can also impact not only the habitat of subnivean creatures or animals that live beneath the snow during the wintertime, but also it can impact essentially any wildlife that are interacting with the snowscape. And so this can include affecting animals' ability to access food resources and forage during the winter, and also impact their ability to move across the landscape. Snow is also incredibly important when we think about conservation and management of wildlife. We know that it can dictate habitat for a number of species that are sensitive and of conservation concern, and it can also drive survival for wildlife and then scale up to impact populations. So it's an incredible factor to be thinking about
as we're thinking about conservation. And this probably comes as no surprise to all of you. Our snow regimes are also changing rapidly due to climate change. So just to give a few examples, global warming is resulting in more severe storm events. It's also resulting in more precipitation in the form of rain rather than snow. It's reducing our snowpacks, and it's also resulting in more extreme and rapid melt events during the spring runoff season. This picture on the bottom right is from Yellowstone when we had a huge flooding event a couple springs back. But really interest in how snow affects wildlife is pretty long-standing. It's no surprise that we've long hypothesized that snow has a huge impact on a variety of wildlife. But what might come as a bit of a surprise to people who don't spend as much time thinking about snow is we haven't always had really sufficient snow data to actually answer research questions related to how it's impacting ecological systems. So for example, it's really critical that we have snow data that essentially matches our wildlife data in terms of space and time. So just to give an example of this, a lot of research historically has used, for example, SNODAS data, which is a relatively coarse resolution. So often these data are at 1 kilometer. So this image shows our snow data essentially for part of the Lander area. And it just leaves a lot to be desired in terms of when we actually think about the actual snow conditions that are occurring on the ground and how they're impacting wildlife. But luckily, we've seen a lot of improvements in recent years in terms of our snow data, which I'll talk a little bit about more. It's also really important that we have essentially relevant snow data that essentially applies to wildlife. So a lot of our snow data that we're collecting is actually for hydrological purposes, essentially to predict how much water we're going to have, especially in the growing season. But it's really important that we're thinking about other kinds of snow conditions that might impact aspects of animal ecology, such as access to forage, animals' ability to move across the landscape and choose routes, for example. So some of these snow attributes, for example, are the fact that snow melts on south-facing slopes, and these areas essentially become hugely important for wintering species, for example, a variety of ungulate species in our area in Wyoming. And similarly, the way snow can blow and drift on the landscape can also have an effect on animals' ability to access food and move across the landscape. And likewise, sometimes we need to have kind of multiple winter variables that combine to impact wildlife. And so one thing we think a lot about is how winter severity is impacting animals. And so this, for example, might be a combination of how much precipitation we're getting in the winter, as well as what the temperature conditions are like, as a combination of those can impact wildlife significantly. And then finally, to essentially address snow wildlife research, it often requires a really interdisciplinary approach. So just to give a background, this is essentially what the team I'm working on is seeking to do. So we're a very multidisciplinary team. We have snow scientists, people with expertise in physics, computer science, mathematics, and then also people like me whose background is in wildlife biology. And essentially, we're all working together to address research related to how snow is impacting wildlife in general. So before I talk specifically about owls, I was just going to share a few of our example applications. So my colleague Adele Ranking has been working on studying how pronghorn in Wyoming are affected by snow conditions and how that actually can carry over to affect survival and habitat selection during the breeding season. And this is an especially sensitive topic given the winter we had in 2022 to 2023. If any of you are from the area, you probably remember the huge die-off of pronghorn that we had across the state due to our really severe winter that we had. Some other work we're doing, we've modeled essentially wolverine den selection. And what we learned is that wolverines, essentially when they're creating their dens, they're choosing the deepest, densest snow that they can find, because they're really at risk of those dens collapsing in on them, especially in the spring, and collapsing on females and on their pups. So we essentially worked to evaluate what those snow conditions are like and model them across the landscape. Something I've been working a lot on lately is mapping polar bear denning habitat. So I know it's a long ways from Wyoming, but polar bears in tundra habitat, essentially it's relatively flat, but you'll have these cut bank features either along the coast or along rivers. And snow will actually drift in those places, and female polar bears will use those snow drifts to place their dens. And so you can imagine we have these really vast landscapes, and we want to avoid these spots where polar bears are beneath the snow denning so that we're not disturbing them. So being able to predict where these dens are in a given year is really important, since it's a function essentially of the precipitation of the year and also the wind conditions of that year. And then we've also been working on a few studies that are essentially evaluating how changing snow conditions affect our ability to survey and monitor wildlife. So for example, for moose, we'll often do aerial surveys, and it's really important that we survey for them prior to when they lose their antlers, but it's actually much easier to see them after the onset of snow. But we know that in the fall and early winter, the timing of snow onset is getting more and more delayed. It's essentially shortening our ability to survey for the species. But then on the other hand, when you think about doing aerial surveys for polar bears, you actually have the opposite relationship, where they're much easier to find when there's not snow on the landscape. So just, you can think about different effects of these changing snow conditions on different species. And then finally, what we're going to focus on today, I've been studying great gray owls for the past 12 years. And one of the things I've been very interested in is how snow affects the behavior and also the fitness of great gray owls right here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So for those of you who are less familiar with this species, this map shows the species range around the world in purple. So you can see the great gray owls occupy some of our northernmost latitudes. They're really occupying boreal forest throughout much of Eurasia and North America. And then if we focus in on the Western United States, you can see that here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we're actually essentially at the southern extent of their contiguous range. There is an isolated species of great gray owls in the Sierra Nevadas of California. But this is just really important to think about in Wyoming when we're thinking about how snow is potentially impacting the species. It's likely that our owls here in Wyoming are going to start facing and dealing with limiting snow conditions earlier than some of the northernmost populations that we have. So it's a really important place to be studying this. And for those of you who are less familiar, I wanted to just share some unique adaptations of the great gray owl that will kind of set up why snow is potentially really important for this species. So great gray owls actually have the largest facial disc of any owl in the entire world. And that facial disc essentially acts as a parabola and directs sound into their ears, which is shown on the bottom right. So great gray owls are really famous for being able to detect prey solely by sound. They also have incredibly quiet flight, similar to many other species of owls. And essentially the way this works is their feathers essentially have these barbs along them, along their primaries. So unlike a raven, which many of you have probably heard before you've seen it flying over, you'll hear the wind hitting its wings essentially. When wind hits a great gray owl's feathers, it essentially runs through these ridges or barbs, and therefore allows it to fly incredibly quietly, and therefore it's able to essentially surprise its prey. Great gray owls are also our largest owl in North America. They're about this tall, they're huge, but if you look at this cross section where it's showing the actual body of the owl as opposed to its feathers, you can see they're almost all downy, fluffy feathers. So they're not that heavy, even though they're incredibly large. And this is just because they're really adapted for these northernmost climates that are incredibly snowy and cold. And then I heard a few people talking to me earlier about how they've been looking for great gray owls. They're also famously good at camouflaging. I don't know how they do it. Somehow they blend in perfectly with lodgepole and aspen trees, which doesn't even quite make sense, but they're incredibly difficult to find. And again, this is another way that they're able to both avoid predators and also surprise their prey. And they have a very unique hunting strategy. Like I said earlier, they hunt by sound primarily. And so they'll often perch and listen for prey. So they'll listen for small mammals. And then when they hear something, they'll actually fly out. And not many raptors do this, but similar to a kestrel, they'll actually hover over their prey for a few moments before dropping directly down onto it. And this includes using this tactic during the wintertime. And so great gray owls are also renowned for their ability to essentially hear small mammals beneath the snowpack and then punch through that to capture their prey, which is essentially shown in this photo series where the owls landing on something in the snow, they kind of collapse onto it, their feet go deep into the snow, And then this owl was successful. This shows on the right, essentially an owl print with some blood, essentially indicating it was successful at capturing a rodent. Pardon me? Subnivean essentially means below the snow. Yeah, thanks. So when I started studying great gray owls, one of the big foci of my graduate research was essentially to track their movements and learn about their key habitat, both during the breeding season, but then I became really interested in their winter movements as well. And so for my research, I've deployed 42 GPS transmitters on great gray owls right here in Teton County, Wyoming. These transmitters you can see on the top right, they fit essentially like a backpack on these birds. And they collected hourly locations for several years on each individual. So I amassed over 130,000 locations for great gray owls in our area. So this map, even though I did all of my trapping kind of locally right here in the Jackson Hole Valley, you can see these dots essentially show all the locations, the GPS points from all of my owls. And you can see that a lot of birds really moved kind of out of the core study area into Idaho, south into the Upper Green area, and even north up into the southern part of Yellowstone National Park.
Question.
Yeah.
When you found the owls to tag them, were they from a certain?
Yeah, so I did a lot of my tagging in the late winter and early spring. So a lot of birds were essentially on their breeding territories by then. So great gray owls are typically back on their territories in late February, early March. That's a good question. So essentially all these birds were breeding right here in the valley. And so with this analysis of these GPS data, one of the first things I was surprised by was how much the habitat that they use during the breeding season versus the winter essentially differs. So just to give a few examples, during the breeding season, these owls are essentially in older age forests, and it doesn't really matter what type. They're in aspen, lodgepole, mixed conifer, deciduous. I'll find them in riparian forests, but essentially anywhere where there's mature forests, we'll find them in the breeding season. Whereas during the wintertime, I really saw them moving to lower elevation riparian forests in particular. Do you have questions? So they essentially start nesting in April to early May. I'll show some slides on the timing of breeding in a little bit. But again, they're back on territories in late winter and defending those. But yeah, they nest essentially in May and June, and then the chicks fledge usually in early July. Another contrast I saw in terms of their habitat was that during the breeding season, these owls are really avoiding people and avoiding development. I've only had 1 or 2 nests on private property, and those were pretty kind of well-conserved properties. But unlike great horned owls, which you'll often hear in residential areas in the Jackson area, great gray owls are really nesting and breeding far away from development. But in the wintertime, this is actually a great time to see a great gray if you're really hoping to and wanting some tips on that, because they're really moving into areas that overlap with us more. So they're moving into developed areas more prevalently. And then in the breeding season, they're really on north-facing aspects, whereas in the winter season, I found them on south-facing aspects. So if we look at all these kind of habitat attributes for the winter, you can start to see how snow is potentially a really critical piece of the puzzle in terms of why they're going where they're going in the winter. So the whole reason we've developed low elevation riparian zones and why we're overlapping with them during the winter is because these areas are less severe in terms of snow. It doesn't make sense for us to build all of our towns up high on the mountains because it would just be a disaster to deal with in terms of infrastructure. So we're essentially utilizing these lower elevation riparian forests, probably for the same reason owls are, and that the snow conditions are less difficult for them. And similarly with aspects, north-facing aspects tend to be our more forested areas, but south-facing aspects, as I shared earlier, tend to melt out earlier during the wintertime, and they also tend to have less deep snow during the wintertime. So this is potentially a reason they're utilizing these areas, specifically during winter. And so one thing that was really exciting to discover about our population of great grays in the GYE is that they're partially migratory. So unlike obligate migrants, which are what we typically think about when we think about bird migration, where birds are moving south in the fall and then moving north again in the spring, partial migrants can really vary in terms of whether they migrate and where they go from year to year. So for our great gray owls, I observed birds remaining on their breeding seasons all year long and never leaving. I also saw birds doing altitudinal migrations where they wouldn't go too far, but they'd drop down in elevation during the wintertime. We also saw more kind of classic migratory movements to a discrete winter range. And then some birds really just seemed to wander and were essentially nomadic during the wintertime. And so I got really interested in wanting to understand what's driving this variation in movement patterns. And essentially wanted to ask the question of whether limiting snow conditions are what's driving these habitat associations and long distance movements. And so one thing I started to think a lot about is something called a locked pasture. And we typically think about this with ungulates. What we mean by this is essentially you can have snow conditions that essentially make forage inaccessible. So for example, caribou are famous for having to deal with these icing events that essentially lock out their ability to access lichen and forbs and grasses. And so even if the snow is not deep, if you have this ice layer, that can't actually access their food. And it's been shown to have hugely detrimental effects on populations and led to big starvation events. But when you're thinking about great gray owls and how they hunt for small mammals beneath the snow during the winter, it kind of makes sense that you could have a similar locked pasture situation where if the snow conditions were limiting, they might not be able to penetrate the snow and access their food resources below it. So one of the main ways this can happen is with ice crusts. And this is mainly a function of rain events during the winter that then refreeze, or a midwinter melt event. If we have a really warm day in the middle of winter and then it refreezes, that snow will essentially melt and then refreeze and create a thick ice layer. And so some of you probably experience when you can walk out on the snowpack and you're not post-holing, you're not punching through, you can kind of just crust cruise. It's pretty fun for us, but if you're trying to get food beneath that snowpack, it would be pretty difficult. And then another way this can manifest on the landscape is through wind. And so when we have big wind events combined with blowing snow, those snow crystals essentially will tumble and become more and more round. And then when the wind friendly stops, it will settle and it almost set up like concrete and create a really impenetrable, strong wind crust. So essentially for my research, I worked with snow scientists in Colorado to model these ice crust and wind crust events throughout the GYE across several years, as well as snow depths and how that evolves over the winter at a really fine spatial resolution and also a 3-hourly time step. So essentially we were modeling how the snow conditions change every 3 hours. So essentially just to show you what this looks like, this just shows a time series of snow depth across the GYE in one particular winter, 2017 to 2018, where essentially the darker color is the deeper snow. And so you can see how from December 1st through March 1st, our snow depth is increasing across the landscape. And I essentially analyze these snow conditions in relation to the GPS data I collected on great gray owls. So one of the first things I essentially analyzed is what's called a step selection. And I was looking at that at the daily movement level. So you can imagine you have a great gray owl here in the wintertime, and it essentially has all these different options for where it can go, within that day. But for some reason, it chooses to go to a particular place, and you can essentially compare where it went to where it could have gone to see if there's a relationship driving those habitat decisions. And what I found was that at the daily level, owls were avoiding areas of deeper snow, and they were avoiding wind crusts in particular. And so one reason why wind crusts were potentially so important when they're making these kind of fine scale movements is that wind crusts are really heterogeneously distributed on landscapes. So we get wind crusts at high elevations, we get them on certain aspects. They don't really form in forested areas because the wind can't blow through there. And so it's more open habitats where you'll have wind crusts evolve. So you can see in this map where darker blue is essentially more persistent wind crusts in our GYE study area. It's relatively easy to make a relatively short movement to get to a refuge or refugia from a severe wind crust. So owls were essentially making these kind of minute movements during the wintertime to avoid these limiting snow conditions. But another thing I was really interested in were those kind of variation in long distance movements patterns that we saw. And so if you imagine this is a breeding range of a great gray owl, at some point in the fall, we're going to have the onset of snow conditions. And something essentially triggers these owls to finally leave. Sometimes owls will stay on their breeding ranges until February. It's not like, snow falls and they take off. Sometimes they're really waiting till later in the winter to actually undertake a migration. But essentially something prompts them to leave and move to a winter range. And again, even on that winter range, they might hang out there for a couple of weeks. But again, sometimes snow conditions change and they move again. So you can essentially analyze, is there a change in these snow conditions that's prompting these decisions to undertake a long distance movement? And so
what might be some of the typical distances between those? Are we just talking about, they're coming lower, like you said, they'll come to a lower elevation?
Yeah, sometimes the distances aren't too far. So especially for the altitudinal migrations, sometimes that's like 10 miles, and it's clear that they finally left their breeding range. So essentially for my analysis, I called a long distance movement twice the size of the breeding home range area, and those are typically 2.5 kilometers across. But I was going to share this later. The longest migration I saw was about 120 kilometers. And so it can vary, but it's very obvious when they leave versus when they're on their breeding range. So good question. And essentially what I found was that for these longer distance movements, owls were essentially leaving in response to more severe ice crust conditions and more persistent ice crusts. And so again, thinking about how these evolve on the landscape, in contrast to the wind crusts that I showed earlier that are really heterogeneous, when ice crusts form on the landscape, it's usually pretty homogeneous. So if you think about a rain event or a warm spell, these typically are driven by really broad synoptic forces that impact broad regions. And so if you look here, you can see the darker blue shows more persistent ice crusts. And it's really impacting pretty much, 2/3 of the study area when these happen. And you can see the lighter colored areas are essentially the refugia from these severe ice crusts. And we're seeing those down in our riparian corridors and also farther to the east in the lower elevation areas of eastern Idaho, where a lot of these birds are actually migrating to out of the valley. So in general, I observed avoidance of deeper snow and of wind crusts and ice crusts. So essentially owls are moving in response to these limiting snow conditions, but they're using different tactics. So again, when we have deeper snow and more severe wind crusts, owls are essentially making really small scale local shifts in their habitat use to avoid them. Whereas when we have these ice crust events that are either severe or highly persistent, they'll actually undertake a longer distance movement and leave their breeding areas. And so we just had a question about this, but the farthest migration event I saw was 120 kilometers. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that these migratory movements are really not typical. On average, birds were migrating 3 times a winter. So we saw as many as 8 different migratory movements for an individual during one winter. And I often would see birds move from their breeding range away from it on a long distance movement, and then come back and leave again, and come back and leave again, over and over again throughout the winter, which is really just unique, especially compared to when we think about traditional migrations for a lot of species. So just to illustrate this just shows in purple the GPS locations for one of our adult female owls that bred in the bottom right here in the southeast. You can see it in Grand Teton National Park. And she actually crossed over Teton Pass to winter near Rexburg, Idaho. But all these dots in between are not a single movement. She's an example of a bird that was moving back and forth over the Teton Range to this wintering area, almost like she was coming back to her breeding range. Conditions weren't suitable and she'd leave again. And if we zoom into that little square of where she was spending most of her winter, you can see it's actually a really tiny area. So she essentially found a relatively intact patch of older riparian forest that's really only about 400 meters across. And she kept going back to that very spot repeatedly over the winter. So there's been a lot of recent research on a number of Arctic raptor species that exhibit different migratory patterns. So it's essentially shown, for example, these species can track the onset of snowmelt during the spring, and they're essentially moving with that as they move back to their Arctic breeding ranges. But the situation we're talking about in terms of snow conditions is really different. This isn't, the slow melt of snow conditions in the spring. These rain on snow events and ice crust events are essentially highly erratic, highly unpredictable. And so it's relatively unknown how wildlife can respond to them when they're so variable in space and time. But it's exciting for me. We've essentially observed how great gray owls are essentially behaviorally flexible in response to them. They're able to move in different ways in order to avoid these limiting conditions. And I just wanted to show these figures of essentially these locked pasture snow conditions over the long term in the GYE. So here we have a essentially 3-time series from 1980 to 2022. And we have wind crust persistence, ice crust persistence, and then maximum snow depth across 40+ years. And we can see that these locked pasture snow conditions are really variable from one winter to the next.
Can you define that term?
Which one? Yeah, so the locked pasture is essentially what I introduced earlier, where your snow conditions are such that animals aren't able to penetrate it to access their food. Yeah, so it's essentially inaccessible. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't clear. But again, it seems like great gray owls are really well adapted to deal with this variation in these conditions. The other thing that I think is really important to point out is that what constitutes key winter habitat for this species is ultimately really dynamic. And so we can't simply designate an area like the National Elk Refuge as winter range for this species, because where these birds are wintering can really vary from one year to the next, which definitely poses a big challenge for how we manage them and conserve them during the winter time. So I just kind of covered how these birds essentially were behaving in response to snow conditions. But I also was really interested in the potential for snow conditions to essentially impact their subsequent reproduction following a winter. So at Teton Raptor Center, we've been monitoring great gray owl territories, breeding territories, for over a decade. We monitor about 32 known territories. And things we look at include territory occupancy. So essentially whether or not there's a pair of adult great gray owls back on the territory in the springtime, whether they actually initiate a nest, whether that nest is successful, and which is essentially whether they fledge young, at least one young, and then the number of young that they successfully fledge.
How big is the clutch?
The clutches on average are 2 here. I've read, especially in Scandinavia, they've seen as many as 7 or 8,
Wow.
which the most I've seen here is 4. But to that point, we've also seen really variable rates in terms of their breeding metrics, essentially. So although occupancy is really consistent, so great gray owls are regularly back on their breeding territories every single spring. Whether or not they actually initiate nesting, whether or not they're successful, and the number of young they have can really vary from year to year.
Do they mate for life?
Yep, so for the pairs I've been tracking, they typically will continue to breed until something happens to one of them, and then they will essentially find a new mate. And that's often when I'll see birds switch nest sites. So they're very faithful to their territories, but they do move to different nest sites periodically, every couple of years. And I kind of anecdotally, I feel like that's when there's kind of a new pairing that happens. So similar to those nesting metrics, I've also seen pretty significant variation in when these birds breed in the springtime. So we had a question about the breeding season earlier, but you can see we've seen as much as a month's difference in terms of the average initiation date for these birds. So in 2015, on average, birds were nesting right around the middle of April, whereas in 2018, they weren't initiating nesting until the middle of May. So it's a pretty significant gap in terms of timing. And this is important because essentially the later owls are nesting, the less successful they are at nesting. So essentially it's less likely they're going to fledge young. And similarly, the number of young they have decreases the later they're nesting. And so thinking about when they're nesting is really important, and the factors that are potentially driving that. And so going back to our locked pasture concept before, essentially weather snow conditions that are limiting their ability to access food in the winter, how that's impacting them. There's high potential that this, even though this is operating during the winter months, it can then carry over to impact the subsequent breeding season. And so this is something I wanted to test. So with this hypothesis, you might expect that, for example, if we have a longer winter snow period, if we have more increased snow depths, and then more severe and persistent snow crust during the winter, that might result in delayed reproduction, so later nesting, and also decreased nest initiation, less success, and number of fledglings in the subsequent spring. And what I found was that, for example, with years that we had more severe wind crusts, we did see a delay in nesting. We also saw a negative effect of wind crusts on territory occupancy, so the rate at which owls were returning to their breeding territories. We saw decreased nest initiation rates, and we saw fewer fledglings in response to years with more severe wind crust conditions during the winter. But what really surprised me, even though those ice crust events can be pretty limiting, they can affect huge regions of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and owls are essentially migrating in response to them. We actually observed a positive relationship between ice crusts during the wintertime and nest initiation and number of fledglings. So this was, again, surprising to me, and to me really suggests that these long distance migratory events, even though these movements can be energetically costly, ultimately it seems like they are adaptive. It's worth it for these owls to move to those kind of refugia like we zoomed in on near Rexburg, Idaho. Maybe there's such abundant prey there, the snow conditions are really not severe, such that it's then carrying over to result in benefits during the breeding season. So in summary, we did find evidence that these winter snow conditions carry over to affect breeding, but the direction of those responses really varied depending on what snow conditions we were analyzing and thinking about. And it's really important that we have that context for how these animals are actually behaving in response to these different snow conditions. And so that's a lot of the work I did for my PhD, but we definitely have some next steps to kind of expand this research. So one thing we're working on right now, we've installed a number of weather stations throughout the GYE, essentially across the study area. Just to put in a plug, we're really hoping maybe to put one in here at the AMK. I think it's an incredible opportunity for a variety of researchers to learn more about the snow conditions, whether you're interested in wildlife or other ecological factors. But these are essentially going to collect really fine scale snow data at these sites. And several of these stations I've installed essentially adjacent to owl territories, so we can have improved information in terms of the on the ground snow conditions where these birds are wintering and also breeding in the springtime. So even though we saw that these birds are responding in a variety of ways to avoid limiting snow conditions, and we're seeing kind of mixed responses in terms of reproduction in the spring, one of the big lingering questions for me is whether or not this species can actually withstand the effects of climate change that we know are occurring. So I just wanted to show this map. It was produced by Audubon, but essentially this shows in red the percentage of the current range for the great gray owl in North America that's essentially anticipated to be lost by 2060 due to anthropogenic environmental change. So for me, this is always shocking. I've spent a lot of time with these owls, and it's hard to believe that within my lifetime, we're not essentially expected to have great gray owls in the lower 48 any longer. So even though we've really learned a lot about how great gray owls interact with snow, how it's affecting them, to me, it's really critical that we continue to monitor them and understand how great gray owls and other species are dealing with these changing conditions. And I just wanted to point out some of our key funders and support. So a lot of this, essentially all this research I did for my PhD at the University of Wyoming through the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. It was done in collaboration with Teton Raptor Center and with SIRA, the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere. It was primarily funded by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, but then we had several key local funders as well, including the UW-NPS grants program, which is affiliated with the AMK. And then also Teton Conservation District, the Megan Burt Raines Wildlife Fund, the Grand Teton Association, and also the Biodiversity Institute at the University of Wyoming. And with that, I hope you guys have a lot of questions. Happy to take them, and feel free to email me as well if you have any follow-up questions or comments. Thank you so much. Oh, you guys.
Okay, so over the time you've been doing the study, what is the population carry? Has it been fairly stable, or do you see it increasing?
Yeah, so for those of you on Zoom, the question was essentially over the course of the study, what's essentially with the status of the population. And so monitoring these nests is a really key piece of that puzzle. So how animals are essentially reproducing and contributing into the population is key. And so as you saw, it's really variable. And so if you can imagine if you studied great gray owls for 3 years, depending on whether it was a good couple years or a low point in those patterns, you could have a really different sense of the population. So to me, one of the biggest discoveries is that variation. We still don't have a strong sense of the trend. There are a lot more owls here than I expected, especially compared to when I started. This is a really important stronghold for the species. Again, we haven't as closely monitored factors like survival, for example. So I've obviously tracked the survival of the birds I'm tagging and tracking, and we've seen a handful of mortality events, nothing shocking. So I'm working with great gray owls in the Yosemite population, and they've had about 25% of their population get hit by cars, which is pretty drastic and very worrisome. We don't see that kind of pattern here. We've had a number of birds struck by vehicles. We've had a handful of predation events. But in turn, a lot of people ask me how many great grays are here, and we still don't know. So that's another reason it's really important to kind of monitor in the longer term, because especially with species that can fluctuate so dramatically, it's really important to continue to keep track of them.
I'm also curious how you do your banding. How do you get them to, how do you put these things on these creatures?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. So essentially the question was how we capture them and band them. So for capturing great grays, they're small mammal specialists. I didn't mention this, but they primarily feed on pocket gophers in our study area, and that's followed by voles. And so we use live mice to essentially lure them into a variety of traps we'll use. And then in terms of banding, we don't sedate them or anything. We'll cover their eyes. So with raptors, if you can, that's why we hood a lot of raptors, but you can't put a hood on an owl. But if you can remove their eyesight, they're relatively calm. But you always have somebody handling the bird, and then somebody doing things like taking measurements or blood samples or banding. Yeah.
How much do they weigh?
Yeah, so essentially the male, so for all raptors, the males are smaller than the females. So essentially the males are about 950 grams and the females are about 1,300 grams. So like we saw with that photo there, they're really all flat feathers. They're very light for how big they are.
3 pounds?
Yeah, at the most, yeah.
What is the lifespan?
Yeah, so the question was what the lifespan is. Again, for a number of raptors, we don't have a strong sense of that. Often that's driven by what we know of birds in captivity. But just to give an anecdote, some of you may have known C3. I think of him as the most famous great gray owl in the world. He used to be along Moose Wilson Road, and so a lot of people got to observe him and photograph him. But I first captured him, I think in 2014. I recaptured him for my graduate work, which is kind of special. And so he ended up being at least 9. So when I captured him, he was already an adult. And so great gray owls are considered an adult at 3. And at that point, you can use their molt to tell if they're a first year, second year, or third year or older. So we don't know if he was older than that, but he was at least 9. And that's the most information I have. But a lot of the birds that we track, they live at least 5 to 6 years. But that's still something we need more information on. Yeah.
Do they have one main predator besides automobiles?
Yeah, people are definitely a huge predator for most wildlife now. I think we're referred to as the super predator. But there isn't a main predator for great gray owls, but we see a variety of species take advantage of them. So I shared that unique hunting strategy. What I didn't say was when great grays land on the ground on their prey, they're often sitting there for several minutes. And so they're highly vulnerable. And also the reason owls get hit by cars so much is that when they get focused in on prey, they kind of block everything else out. And so you can imagine when they're on the ground trying to grab it at that small mammal, they're not necessarily well aware of what's around them. And so we've had coyotes predate them. I had a colleague from the Teton Cougar Project. They were collaring and tracking cougars, and they went to a kill site, and there was a great gray owl there. And so I was very offended that their study species had predated mine. We've had bears go up into nests, and we've seen, Steve Mathis, who I've I worked with on a book on great gray owls. He did a lot of these amazing photos I shared with you, but he actually observed 3 black bears going up into a nest and the great grays fought them off, which was pretty remarkable.
How do we find their nests?
How do you find their nests?
Yeah.
They are out there, I'll tell you that. So it's a lot of work to find great gray owl nests. I didn't talk a lot about it, about their behavior, but unlike species like the great horned owl and the barred owl, these birds are much quieter. They're much more secretive. They're famous for being elusive. It's why we don't know a lot about them. And so
I like that. They come visit me frequently.
I have lots of lucky. Yeah, in terms of their nests, so they'll call in the spring and essentially defend their territories and find mates locally. And then once it becomes nesting season, they get very quiet again. So they're highly secretive on their nests. They camouflage well.
And that's when they go down.
No, that's in the winter time. They'll move down in elevation.
Oh, really? That's when they're, I'm at 8,000 feet.
Yeah, so I've heard, so we have nests, for example, up on Togety, they'll nest at high elevations. I've heard of birds nesting up to 9,000 feet.
I don't see them on me at all. They let us approach and take pictures.
Yeah, so that's a really, sorry for those of you on Zoom, but that's a really neat thing about great gray owls. They're really hard to find, but for whatever reason, they aren't as flighty as some raptor species. And so if you do find them, that's why photographers love them so much. And it's amazing for me to get to observe them as a biologist. They're pretty tolerant of people observing them. So you can get
Land on my deck.
close. Exactly. I've had a few people tell me they've had them land on their decks. You guys are all very lucky. I've not had that experience. How about you in the back?
You were talking about the main culture of how the sound ground keep that to the vehicle nets, where most of the pit birds and most of the covered hit while they were nesting on the ground rather than on the wood.
I think most of the car collision strikes are happening when birds are probably coming, like crossing the road to get to prey, would be my guess. So if you think about where our roadways are actually rooted, they're going through meadows, and great grays essentially are famous for nesting in forested areas, but then they hunt out in open areas. And so where our roadways go is essentially probably used to be really good foraging habitat, maybe still is good foraging habitat. It just, there's increased risk there. But for a lot of raptor species, they get so keyed in when they see prey that they'll just kind of focus in on it. Another thing to think about too, with snow conditions, a lot of owls will get hit in the wintertime, and those roads are essentially when you'll see mice running across the road if you drive home at night, for example, and a lot of raptors, especially owls, will take advantage of that. And so especially if they're not able to get to food beneath the snow, they often will use those roadways probably as a food resource, and then comes with increased risk.
Is there particular types of trees that they choose, and what do they use their nesting concerns?
Yeah, so for nest sites, not everybody realizes this, but owls don't actually no owl species make their own nests. So they really rely on a pre-existing structure. So you have all your cavity nesting species that will nest in woodpecker holes, and burrowing owls will nest in essentially burrows on the ground created by prairie dogs. And so for some of our bigger owls like great grays and great horns, they're not in cavities, they're in large structures. And so they're essentially utilizing whatever structure is available. And so a lot of, I think about 40% of our nests are, for great gray owls, are old goshawk nests. They'll actually take those over. Goshawks, as part of their courting, they'll build a new nest every season. And so there's all these extra alternate nests that are essentially available for great grays to use.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So they're related.
Yeah, we'll see the nests in close proximity to each other, which is pretty fascinating. Great gray owls are also famous for using large snags. And so this is something we think about with forest management, is retaining those huge old dead trees that have broken off tops that they can actually nest on top of. And then we also often see them, some of you might be familiar with the large mistletoe growths. Great grays will actually nest on top of those. They're very hard to see, often in snags and in those mistletoes, just because they can kind of tuck down in them. But those are the primary structures they're using. So essentially whatever, that's why when I showed the breeding season habitat associations, they're essentially in mature forests where you can have those types of structures that are large enough for them to nest in.
Your second to last slide, the projected reduction in the range by 2060 is incredibly impressive.
I think so too.
What needs to change that future not to occur?
Yeah, and so for that projection, it's taking into account not just climatic changes, but all anthropogenic environmental change. And so a huge factor for a lot of forest raptors is just habitat loss. And that can happen in a variety of ways. Obviously, we have development, we have resources extraction, that's a big one, especially across boreal forests. We think of those areas as being vast, but they're being highly altered right now for resource extraction. Drought and beetle kills is another big one where we're losing essentially habitat, and similarly wildfires. And a lot of those are obviously linked with changing climate conditions. But to me, one of the most important things, and that was a big driving factor of this research, was to understand what habitat they need, because from there we're well poised to start making big strides in actually conserving that habitat. So for me, that's one of the biggest factors, especially when we think about those range shifts. There's definitely other things we can do to help great gray owls. For example, in California, they're thinking a lot about, so we were deploying transmitters there and collecting really fine scale 5-minute data to understand how owls are actually using the roadways. And from there, they want to actually implement different conservation actions to hopefully reduce vehicle strikes. So whether that's changing speed limits in certain areas, they are thinking of removing perches along roadways in places where they're getting hit or using more consistently. Things like that are other things that we can kind of do right away to help this species. Yeah.
I was reading that birds like osprey and bald eagles who are hunt fish, when they're hunting, actually, where they see the fish down here is not actually where the fish is, because of the way the light is bent. So it also, the article also says carries over to great gray owls. And so I'm wondering, when you say that they, they hear something, they sit there for a while, are they kind of mentally calibrating or trying to figure out exactly where not only that prey species is based on what's coming into the triangulation process with their ears, but also making some kind of a minute adjustment, because the snow is so deep and that sound is not going to come exactly the way it seems into their ears. Is that why they're sitting there for a while?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those of you on Zoom, essentially, the question related to the acoustics that are going on beneath the snow and whether owls are perched for so long as they're kind of pinpointing where the prey is beneath the snow and essentially adjusting where they're going to hit it. And I can't speak to why they take so long, but they definitely, you can tell when they've heard something. And it happens when I'm trapping sometimes too. They'll even, and I'm not putting my traps beneath the ground, so they can see it, but they don't come in immediately. They definitely take their time, and they'll definitely check it out. And I think you'll see them moving their head around, and I think that's exactly right. They're most likely figuring out exactly where they want to go to have the most success. But what is really interesting is, I wasn't part of this research, but some folks essentially put audio broadcasters beneath the snow, and they did all these experiments related to the acoustics of snow, and the snow can really change, the conditions of the snow can change how sound carries through it. And what they found was that great gray owls essentially were figuring out exactly, they were essentially calibrating, like you said, which is really cool. So you should look up that paper if that's something you're really interested in, because somebody just was specifically looking at that and how sound can essentially change depending on certain
It
conditions.
is fascinating watching them tilt, go different directions, put their disc in different places.
Exactly.
Different readings,
Yeah,
and drop like a little
yeah, exactly.
From what distance are they able to hear the prey? Like 2 miles?
Oh, no, yeah, so for a lot of raptors, it's kind of famous where like soaring eagles see prey 2 miles away. And but for great grays, it's usually a few studies have kind of tried to get at this, but usually they're perched and then they're going out to something no more than 35 meters away. So you'll often, especially when they're actively foraging, they'll kind of move from perch to perch, and they'll sit here for a few minutes and then move again. But they're really hunting locally. And because they need perches, they're moving either along forest edges or through forests that are relatively have open understory, and so they're kind of in areas with more cover. Exactly.
All right, everyone, let's thank our speaker one more time.